So I feel like I'm up here giving a church service. So, dearly beloved, we're gathered here today to learn why remittances don't appear to affect growth. I should say that it's great to be at this conference to give this talk. Michael and I had a car from Casablanca to Ifran last year, and we basically sketched out this whole paper in the car ride from Casablanca to Ifran. So I'm just saying to AFD that if you have the conference in Tahiti next year, imagine how productive we'll be on the plane ride there. So, thinking about different topics. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the rise of remittances. So this is a graph that many of you have seen showing different international financial flows, and you see the dark line here being remittances, which have been hovering along in the 1970s, 1980s, and then they start sort of taking off. And so between 1990 and 2000, global remittances to developing countries doubled, and then between 2000 and 2010, they tripled. Okay, so massive growth in remittances. And as I say, this is a graph you've seen before, so this graph just is probably the most famous graph that we see with remittances. IMF publications, World Bank publications. Dean had it in his slides this morning. He has it in his JP piece. So, it's pretty interesting to know what's going on with this big growth in remittances. So, the first narrative that one hears is that this is a wonderful thing. This is from the Dilip Rather and the Global Economic Prospects, that there's this massive growth in remittances. This is having a large positive effect on incomes in developing countries and might lead to economic growth. So that's sort of the big thing people are maybe looking at. But then if we look at economic growth and remittance growth, then you see that there's a whole lot of countries that have had very high levels of remittance growth and not much in terms of economic growth or vice versa. Obviously, there's some countries here that look like they've had massive remittance growth, and we can't see so much, so Nigeria and Sierra Leone here. So let's just zoom in there, and this is our cross-country correlation over 20 years, that there's really not much going on here between countries' levels of remittance growth and countries' level of economic growth. And so this slope is 0.016, it's insignificant. So this has led to the second narrative, which is, this is the IMF, or at least some people at the IMF's view. So we've got World Bank versus IMF here. So the IMF is saying, remittances don't seem to make a contribution to economic growth. And the most persuasive evidence of this is that we can't point to a single success story. We can't point to a country that's really benefited a lot in terms of being able to grow through getting a lot of remittances. No country can credibly claim that this has happened to it. Okay, so we've got these really distinctive viewpoints here. We've got this one viewpoint that there's all these massive amounts of money flowing into developing countries. That should be causing growth. We've got this other viewpoint saying, well, actually, but if you look, point me the country where you can show me that that's the case. And so, what's going on? And so that was sort of our starting point. And this was something that you hear policymakers sometimes saying is, where is the growth coming from in our country from all these remittances? And so this was what got us actually talking on the road to Ifran was sort of, why don't we see more growth from these remittances? And so, that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, so obviously, there's quite a lot of literature looking at macro impacts of remittances. This is not a literature that I typically like to engage in, but I will sort of give a little summary of it, and forgive me if I'm summarizing your contribution very badly to it if you have contributed here. But let's just start. Sorry with equations during lunchtime, but let's just start with a production function where we have national income being some function of capital and labor. We've got this A term which you can call all your favorite things to, and then if we just take a partial derivative, then we would think that partial derivative with respect to remittances with respect to rho, we would think that we should be getting a positive effect, right? If remittances are building up capital stock, then why is that not leading to growth? Well, if we take total derivatives, then we get the explanations that people talk about in the literature. So the first thing that we all worry about, if we're micro guys, is that remittances are not proxying for build-up of capital, that they're not manna from heaven falling down on these lovely countries, but they're completely endogenous, and the reason why capital stock is and remittances are changing could be related to underlying things that are also causing problems with growth. So, a country has a crisis that causes a whole lot of remittances to flow in, and so, it's not surprising that we don't see high remittances associated with high growth when remittances are the response of migrants to low growth. So that's sort of the natural thing that we often worry about. The second thing people have talked about is just like the cross-country growth literature, is to say, well, there's heterogeneity in the responses, and so they've really looked at this A and R term and said, the mediating factor is sort of what the institutions are in the country and what the financial system is in the country, and so, just as aid can be good for growth if you have countries with the right characteristics, maybe remittances will only be good for growth if the country has the right banking system and the right institutions to be able to use that. And so, basically this R term is correlated with the response of capital to remittances in a way that if you don't deal with it properly, it's going to cause a bias. Now, the sort of second set of macro effects is to say remittances make people lazy. You send money in and then everybody stops working. And so there's this offsetting effect on labor supply. And then, there's this final thing that says remittances make people lazy in a different way. It undermines institutions. They stop agitating for better institutions in their country because now they can just rely on money from overseas. They don't need the government to be providing public goods to them. They don't need to sort of demand so much from the government. And so, remittances are undercutting or alternatively, there's some Dutch disease thing going on here where remittances are coming in, they're driving up the exchange rate, they're killing all your exports in your country. So again, there's this negative effect. And so we're not saying that any of these other stories might not be true. We're just saying you don't need any of these other stories to explain why we don't see much going on in terms of remittances and growth. Okay, so we want to talk about three explanations today for why we don't think you can find with an effect of remittances on growth. And I'll focus most of it on this first point, which is that most of this magic figure that I just showed you that we've been seeing time and time again is actually an illusion, that most of this growth in remittances is not true growth. Then we'll come to the second point, which is to say even if this was all true growth, you just lack statistical power to find effects even if they did exist. And then thirdly, we'll make this related point, which is that part of the reason that there's no power is that remittances don't come from the money rain coming down from the sky, but they come from migrants going abroad, and that labor leaving the country has this offsetting effect. Okay, so as I said, I'll talk mostly about this remittance growth illusion and go through why we think most of this magic growth that we've seen is not actually true. Okay, so we all worry about data a lot. When you start trying to understand remittance data, it's kind of scary. So let's just remind you of where those numbers that we all sort of put in as that opening paragraph and an introduction before we never refer to them again come from. So this macro data on remittances, the IMF collects this data and they put them in the International Financial Statistics. They have sort of traditionally had three categories in the balance of payments manual. So they've had this category of workers' remittances, which are current transfers by migrant workers. They've had this category of compensation of employees, which is meant to be income earned by temporary workers. And so you've got to somehow distinguish who's a temporary worker versus a migrant worker. And then they've got capital asset transfers. So when a migrant moves from one country to another and takes a bunch of capital with them, then they're counting that flow as this third category. So the World Development Indicators, which is where a lot of the studies just grab it, the remittances numbers from, and what the World Bank uses in making those magic figures that we just looked at, combine the first two categories, which are workers' remittances and compensation of employees. But, of course, in practice, it's really difficult to separate all these categories. And so actually the IMF changed the balance of payments manual a few years ago, and now they don't even call it remittances at all. They call it personal transfers because they recognize, hey, we can't really separate remittances from a number of other transfers. But despite that, the World Development Indicator still calls these things workers' remittances. People still put them up in these graphs as workers' remittances. And when we're talking about remittances, that's what we're doing. And so the question is, where does the IMF get this data from? Well, they get this data from central banks, and the central banks then in turn have to get the data from somewhere. And so the central banks get it by requiring different financial institutions in their country to report to them. And so they ask money transfer operators, MTOs, and banks to give them reports on transactions, and then those transactions get mapped to these categories. And so, of course, the problem is that the coverage of this can be quite spotty. It can change over time, and it's become more and more of an issue in recent times now that there's so many more ways that you can send remittances. When there was only one bank in the country, or everybody sent their money through the post office, it was relatively easy to collect that data. Now that there's all these electronic ways of sending payments, you can you've got all this competition amongst different providers. There's suddenly a lot more for them to try and take account of. And sort of one of the big stories over the last couple of decades with collecting this information has been these two acronyms here, which are to do with financing against terrorist financing and against anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. So these are both sort of two efforts that were coming in sort of starting in the late 1990s, but really ramped up following September 11th, 2001. And so there was a lot of concern that the Saudi terrorists in the US had received funding somehow from people going through money transfer operators, or it wasn't quite clear. And so then these regulations came into place that really put a lot more requirements on money transfer operators in terms of them being licensed, in terms of know your customer regulations, in terms of what level of transaction now had to get reported to the authorities rather than get reported before, much better record keeping, etc. So suddenly you're getting a lot of transactions that previously wouldn't have to get recorded, starting to get recorded. And so we're going to look and see what's going on with all this, but this is just to give you some background of what's going on behind the scenes. But we want to sort of look at this in two ways. So the claim that we're making is most of this growth in remittances is not real growth, and so we want to look and say, how much of the growth in remittances that we can explain really seems to be real growth. And so if we write this identity here, we can write remittances are going to be the number of migrants you have times the earnings of those migrants times the share of money that they remit. Okay, so remittances are migrant stock times the income per migrant times the share of income remitted. And so if remittances are growing, it must be the case that growth is coming from one of these different terms. And so what we want to look at is sort of trying to decompose the macro growth in remittances into what we know about these other terms and how they've been changing, and use that to try and persuade you that hey, it doesn't seem like these other terms are consistent with the growth that we see at the macro level in remittances. Okay, so the first thing you want to know is, how much have migrant stocks risen versus remittance growth? And so here's a graph here. You've got migration growth for different countries along the x-axis. You've got real remittance growth along the y-axis. This is again between 1990 and 2010, so the last 2 decades. I should say the reason we sort of start around 1990 is that there's very little remittance data for a lot of countries before 1990. So part of the reason for that growth is that suddenly there was all these countries that started reporting anything rather than zero to the authorities, sort of starting in the late 80s. So that's we're going to look at that period where remittances have doubled and then tripled. Okay, but what you see here is that there's just a huge number of countries that are well above this 45-degree line, huge number of countries for which the growth in recorded remittances in the macro data are way, way above the growth in their migration stocks. We had a big data session yesterday with trying to know about how we measure these migration stocks. We're using UN data here, which was people are going to hopefully have some updates on better bilateral data, but we're using what's currently available. So what you see there, and I think this is not going to matter that much, sort of on the aggregate, is that developing country migrant stock rose about 50% between 1990 and 2010. Okay, so whether you take the OECD or the UN or the World Bank OECD, whichever bilateral stock matrix you're taking, that number maybe is going to end up being 47% versus 52% or something, but it's not going to make much difference there. So this is quite big growth in migrant stock. This is not migrants per capita. This is just migrant stock. So of course the world population's been growing as well. But over the same period, recorded remittances rose 557%. Okay, so migrant stock only grew 9% of the growth in remittances over this time period. So that's clearly only one part of what's going on. So then you think, well, maybe migrants have suddenly become a lot more prosperous, maybe they're earning a lot more, and that's why remittances are going up. And so, the data on migrant earnings is much less good than the data we have on migrant stocks, which you already know is problematic enough. So here's what we do. There's no global time series data on the earnings of migrants, so we proxy it by looking at what the growth and incomes have been in the destinations that those migrants go to. Okay, so we say, okay, migrants from Mexico, they go to the US. Between 1990 and 2010, how much did US income rise? Migrants from El Salvador also go to the US, we'll map them to there. Migrants from Paraguay are going to Argentina as their main destination. Let's look at that. And so we weight that all up then by the shares of migrants going to different countries to get a developing country increase in incomes, which is 47% for these developing country migrants over the 1990 to 2010 period. So obviously you want to know, is this a good approximation for how much migrants' incomes have risen? So we can look at that in a couple of ways. So first of all, you think, well, migrants are going and they're probably earning a lot less than the average citizen of the country they're going to. So maybe we'd be concerned if growth in income, in GDP per capita, is not really approximating the growth in income for somebody at the sort of 20th percentile of the income distribution or 40th percentile of the income distribution. So there's nice new work by Art Cray and David Dollar, which looks at how growth of the bottom 20% and the bottom 40% of the income distribution in different countries around the world varies with income growth on average. And so what they see is there's a one-to-one movement. So this whole sort of story that we've heard in the US where incomes are really shot up for the top 1% and then been very flat for the rest of the population isn't really a global phenomenon. It's sort of something that when you look in most developing countries, most destination countries, the income of the poor has grown sort of one-to-one with the income of the rich. So it seems like that's sort of one reason to say this might be all right. The second thing is we look at US Census data where we can get income for migrants, and so what you see here is if we use the US Census and the American Community Survey, then the average income growth for developing country migrants over that period is 19%, and US real GDP per capita growth was 23%. So at least for the US, this approximation seems pretty good. There's this data from these other studies to suggest that maybe it's not so bad for a lot of other countries. And then to the extent that migrants are going to countries where they're not really benefiting from the growth in those countries, so maybe migrants going to some of the Gulf countries or oil revenue countries, we would expect migrants' incomes to be growing at a slower rate than the income of those countries as a whole, in which case what we're getting is an upper bound. So, taking all this stuff together, we can sort of decompose the growth in remittances. So the growth in remittances we can decompose as the growth in the migrant stock, the growth in the wages of those migrants, and then the growth in the interaction term. So if we put those two things together, this top line gives us what we should be expecting to see here. We have 557% growth in remittances over this period, 50% growth in migration stock, about 47% growth in income. So altogether, these fundamentals account for 21% of the observed growth in remittances. So put another way, 80% of this growth in remittances is not explained by fundamentals. It seems to be sort of illusionary. And the rest of this table shows you the growth in recorded remittances for the countries that have had the largest absolute growth in remittances over the 1990 to 2010 period. So if we're trying to explain the global patterns, then these are the countries that most contribute to global remittance growth in developing countries. And you can just see how incredible some of these growth rates in recorded remittances are. 1,200% in India, 10,000% in China, 120,000% in Nigeria. So, if you're thinking that these numbers can be anything but incredible, something's wrong here. So you'll see there's, for those countries, the share of recorded remittance growth that's accounted by these fundamentals is less than 5%. There's a couple of countries here where you get actually more than 100%, and they're countries where the migrants are going to very oil-rich destinations. So Colombians going to Venezuela, maybe their incomes are not growing with the income of the Venezuelans, and same with Egyptians going to the Gulf. But for most of the countries, and certainly these countries that have had the highest rates of growth, the fundamentals don't seem to explain it. So this decomposition here assumes that migrants have been sending the same share of their income over time. And so now, we just look at sensitivity. We don't have any data that allows us to see for a lot of countries whether migrants are changing the share of the income that they remit. We heard from Philippe's presentation yesterday that maybe over time migrants are actually becoming less tied to families, more individualistic. If we believe that, we might think that they're actually sending less remittances over time. There's some evidence of that for Mexico, where the Mexican migrants coming to the US are now sort of likely to come for longer. They're likely to come with their families. They're sort of older, and as a result, there's some work at least suggesting the share of income getting remitted for Mexicans has fallen over time. We don't know that for across the world, so we just look at this sensitivity analysis, and here's our 21% of total remittance income growth accounted for if there's no change. If people are now sending 25% more of their income, which seems pretty unlikely given what we've heard from these other countries, even then we'd only be accounting for a third of global remittance growth by these fundamentals. And so it seems from the macro data that really, if we look at this decomposition, almost 4/5 of remittance growth are unaccounted for by anything that should be explaining that remittance growth. Okay, so that's our stab at sort of convincing you with macro data. And so then we want to look at some specific countries and convince you with some micro data as well. So what we did was we tried to look at countries where we could get household budget surveys for a decent number of periods of time. We wanted at least 5 sort of rounds of household budget surveys where we could get remittances in these household budget surveys and compare the remittance growth that we see in household surveys to the remittance growth in the macro data. So here's Mexico. So what you see is during the second half of the 1980s and during the 1990s, the top line is the macro growth, the bottom line is the micro remittances. I should say these are in levels now. Remittances are therefore growing at exactly the same rate in the micro and macro data in the 1990s, and then suddenly you see in the early 2000s, the macro remittances dramatically increased from Mexico, and the micro remittances increased by a lot less. And what's going on here? Well, in 2002, following these U.S. enforcement, the Mexicans changed their banking laws so that now money transfer operators had to start reporting to the central bank, whereas previously it had only been banks that were reporting to the central bank. So not surprisingly, macro remittances increased dramatically, but we don't see that in the household surveys, which did not change its definition of what they were asking people. Okay, so this is Mexico. What about Peru? Peru, you see this similar thing. We have data sort of popping along, and then right around 2002, they changed their anti-money laundering laws in Peru, and lo and behold, macro data shoots up, micro data hovers along just like it had been doing. Honduras, even more stark, again, changes with the anti-money laundering laws following 2001. Pakistan, not surprisingly, got a lot of attention from U.S. Regulators following 2001, and you sort of see, again, this divergence in Pakistan. And then El Salvador, similarly, much higher macro growth than micro growth over the 2000s period. So, here's 4 countries where we're getting that same sort of big spike up in 2001. But, this would be fine if we knew that it was all a 2001 story. At least we could say, well, maybe we could just look at the 1990s and, be happy with that. So let's look at Turkey. So Turkey, we saw, in Philippe's discussion the other day, this remittances falling in Turkey as other things were rising. Here, the macro data on remittances is falling in Turkey. The micro data is actually rising. So what happened in Turkey? Well, Turkey, for some reason, used to think that tourism receipts were remittances. And so they used to record tourism receipts amongst their remittances, and then they changed that, and not surprisingly, the macro data on remittances starts falling in Turkey. And so the micro data shows remittances were rising over the same period. Jamaica, we look in 1994, they changed their regulations in Jamaica so that building societies became registered financial institutions and now had to start reporting to the central bank. So here, you get this jump like we saw in the other countries in 2001, but it's happening in 1994. Ghana is the story that I think a lot of us actually have in mind, which is just that the things have been getting better over time. So Ghana is the only country we have here where the macro data on remittances is showing vastly lower remittance rates than the micro data. So the micro data is sort of showing remittances just jumping around. The macro data is showing remittances growing. So in Ghana, the central bank reports remittances at 10 times the remittances that it actually reports to the IMF. So Ghana doesn't actually know what its remittances are, but it differs dramatically depending on who it's telling what it tells the remittances to be. So I think this is a story in a lot of the world which is just increasing coverage of remittances. And then finally, Paraguay seems to be a country where nothing much happened. They're not that connected to the US. There was no changes that we could find in banking laws, and the two series sort of seem to actually follow each other reasonably well over this time. So out of the 9 countries we look at, you can see Paraguay seems to be the one where you might want to trust the macro data to give you right growth rates, and the rest of the countries, we'd be pretty suspicious. So, again, if you're worried about our macro decomposition and you have concerns about particular data sets or particular things, I think the combination of the macro data and the micro data together, both point very much in the same direction, which is that, most of this growth that we see in remittances over this 1990 to 2010 period is due to changes in measurement, and we estimate about 80% of that growth is due to changes in measurement. So next time you're putting up that graph, don't believe it. So therefore it's not really surprising if most of the growth that we see in remittances is just changes in measurement. It's not surprising it doesn't show up in changes in growth, right? All that's happening is we're just changing what we have. So, then you might think, well, now things are really good. Now, maybe we'll have hope going forward. We've sorted out all these problems, we've regulated all these things, and now, we've got closer to the truth. And so, that's a hard question to address, but from looking through it, it's not clear that we're actually getting that much closer to the truth in a lot of countries either. That there's a lot of concerns that a lot of things that are coming in and getting recorded as remittances might not actually be remittances. So now I buy something on PayPal and I send a money transfer to somebody in Mexico to buy it. That looks like it's a remittance, but it's a trade transaction. Or I send money for housing finance. And so this was the story with talking with somebody who'd worked in the central bank in Albania. She said, we suddenly got all these surges in money, and it was people coming to buy property in Albania and sending it sort of through these transfers. And so it's not clear that we should expect things to necessarily be measuring what we would like to think about as remittances necessarily a lot better, even though there's been all these changes in measurement. Probably on average that's the case, but it's going to be a lot of heterogeneity across countries. And so it's not like there's a consistent measurement that's been the exact same for all countries that we can difference out. There seems to be a lot of heterogeneity across countries in what's going on. Okay, so this is sort of the big point. First big point is that, one of the reasons we don't find an impact of remittances on growth is because most of what we think of as remittance growth is not really remittance growth, it's imagination. So then the second point I want to make is one about statistical power. And so this is something that I spend most of my time worrying about when I'm doing randomized experiments, is have I got enough statistical power to detect an effect if there is one. And so what we do is we look and we say, imagine that I hadn't showed you that first bit. Imagine that all this remittance growth was real, and let's just look at a panel where we have 10-year growth rates in GDP, 10-year growth rates in remittances, and let's work out how much power we'd have to detect an impact of remittances on growth. And so here's some power curves for just doing a bilateral regression. So this is going to be a regression with 100 observations, so 50 countries for 2 years each, or 100 countries for 2 years, or 150 countries for 2 lots of 10 years each. And what you see is that power is very low in any case. So typically when we're doing an experiment, we want at least 80% power. Okay, so remember, your power is your ability to reject the null if the null is false. Here, at most, even if every dollar in remittances went 1 for 1 to $1 in growth, and we had 150 countries with data, which is way more than we have, we'd only have about 30% power to detect that effect. So even if there was an effect, we wouldn't be able to detect it. Things don't get much better if we do multivariate regressions, where we chuck in the whole kitchen sink of controls people put in cross-country regressions and try and soak up as much of other stuff going on that's probably also getting driven by migration remittances, and so we probably don't want to chuck in. But even if we chuck all that stuff in, we still have way below the amount of power that we'd like to have. So then finally, we just wanted to sort of do a little back of the envelope calculation and say, what might this effect be, and what would the actual power be? Okay, and so you don't need to see a lot of equations at this time. So we put in a little toy model where we basically say that because of the offsetting effect of labor, that when migrants leave, they're taking labor out of the country, they're sending remittances in effect. The country's losing the labor and the wage that this person would have earned at home, they're getting the remittances back. So whether or not we see an increase in growth is going to depend on whether the increase in wages abroad relative to the wages at home is enough to offset the fact that some of the remittances, some of the income abroad is not sent back, some of the income that's sent back is saved or spent on imports. And so, if we run through, we sort of, in our little toy model, you need the income gap to be sort of a factor of about 5.6. And so we just go through this one example where we say, okay, suppose migrants earn $15,000 abroad, they earn $2,000 at home, so they're coming from Ghana or Moldova or somewhere like that. They remit 20% of their income. They consume 90% of what families at home consume, about 90% of what's remitted. About 10% of what's consumed goes on imports, then sending money to a family of 4 at home, we would have this wage gap being enough that we should see a positive effect, but the per capita benefit's only about $250. If we think of the country losing 2.5% of its population over 10 years, which is a pretty fast flow, then income per capita is just going to rise by 0.13%. Okay, so if we think about that, migrant stock is increasing by 50% from 5% to 7.5%, then this coefficient that we're looking at here is 0.113, is going to be 0.35, and our power for doing that is going to be about 12%. Okay, so even if we put in some sort of realistic numbers on what we might expect the effects to be, and the money was coming magically from heaven, so we didn't need to worry about endogeneity, and we could just go through and try and detect this effect, and we'd measured it all correctly, we'd still have almost no show of detecting it. Okay, so to conclude, we're saying basically don't do this stuff. That most remittance growth is illusionary. The tests lack power, and any effects are offset by the effects of lost labor. So that it's going to be very hard to detect effects. We're assuming here that there's no long-term positive effects on TFP or multipliers, but it's really hard to think about counterfactuals and data to what's the effect of 40 years of migration on the Philippines. Those are pretty hard problems to solve. This doesn't mean migration's not important. We're all at this conference talking about all these other effects of migration. We know migration raises the incomes of the migrants themselves and their families a lot. It's just that they tend to be small shares of the population, and the sort of change in migrants is pretty small, so it's going to be very hard to detect those effects on growth. So our conclusions are, please don't show us any more remittance and growth regressions. It's really not possible at the moment to reliably measure the effect of remittances on growth. And anybody talking about the massive change and massive growth in remittances should realize that most of that seems to be illusionary and reflecting changes in measurement practices rather than genuine changes. So I think I'm about right on time. Thanks.